Let's review the ABC process. Remember, presenting textual evidence the correct way is a key to success in this class, this year, and next. The ABC process has 3 simple steps. Part A is an introduction. You provide context and make it clear what point you want to make. Step B provides the actual textual evidence. Remember, you'll need a signal phrase and a parenthetical reference. Part C is the explanation. This is the part of your writing that connects the textual evidence in B to what you introduced in Part A. Writing a strong Part A, or introduction, really involves 2 steps. First, you need to think about what context or information about the source you're using you will provide. How will your audience know where in the text your information is coming from? This is especially important if your audience isn't familiar with the text, but you need to do it even if your audience is. The other step, just as important, is making it clear what main point you are trying to make. Often, that main point will be given to you in the form of a writing prompt. It's important that you look at that prompt, make that point clear, and stick to it throughout your writing. Step B, textual evidence, involves 3 parts: a signal phrase, the actual evidence, and a parenthetical page reference. You can't really pick a signal phrase until you have the textual evidence. When choosing the textual evidence, it's important to recognize that you have to understand why you're choosing the text you've chosen. Can you explain how those words connect to the point you're trying to make? Do you understand the connection between those words and the main idea of the writing prompt? If you do, just pick those words. If you don't understand why the words you've chosen are important, they probably aren't. Remember, you can use things like an ellipsis to remove some words from a sentence to just focus on the main ideas that you need. However, be sure not to take something out of context so much that you lose the meaning the author intended. You have to be consistent with that. Once you have your textual evidence, introduce it with a signal phrase. Remember, this is a transition into that quoted material. And of course, at the end, include a parenthetical reference. That'll tell us the page number or numbers that your text comes from. Part C, the explanation, is the most important part of the ABC process. In Part C, you answer this question: how do the words or textual evidence you have chosen support the main point of your response? It is critical that you take words or ideas directly from that quoted evidence and tie it directly back to the main point introduced in Part A. You should avoid making the pitfall of continuing with the textual evidence idea and just summarizing what happens next in the story, or getting off track and making a completely different point in Part C than you intended. Remember, Part C connects your B to your A. Every time, no exceptions. Let's look at an example. This one comes from our semester exam. The directions say, read the prompt below, then read the passage, then respond to the prompt using the ABC process for presenting textual evidence. So let's read the prompt. It says, 13. Use evidence from the passage above, from page 36 of your text, to prove Ulrich and Georg are sincere in wanting to improve their relationship. The passage reads, for a space, both men were silent, turning over in their minds the wonderful changes that this dramatic reconciliation would bring about. In the cold, gloomy forest, with the wind tearing in fitful gusts through the naked branches and whistling round the tree trunks, they lay and waited for help that would now bring release and succor to both parties. And each prayed a private prayer that his men might be the first to arrive, so that he might be the first to show honorable attention to the enemy that had become a friend. Well, Part A is the first step in this process, and I remember I need to do two things. First, I need to ask myself, what context or information about the source will you provide? Second, what is the main point of the response you are writing? If I think about these two questions, I'll start on the right track. So, let's look back at the prompt. It says, use evidence from the passage above, from page 36 of your text, to prove Ulrich and Georg are sincere in wanting to improve their relationship. Based on this prompt, I know what point I need to make. I need to say that they're sincere in their offers of friendship. I shouldn't say anything else. That's my main point. Part A also requires that I provide some context for where this passage takes place in the story. I know this story pretty well, and I remember that this is the part in the story after Georg and Ulrich had confronted each other under the tree, and they were about to shoot each other, and then the tree fell on them. At first, they went through some difficult times, arguing with each other and threatening to kill one another, but eventually they came around. Finally, they decided they could be friends. This is just at that part. So, for my context, I could say something like, this passage happens just before the climax of the story. Ulrich and Georg had been trapped under the tree, and they went through the process of letting their anger ease up, eventually becoming friends. I now have Part A written. It says, Ulrich and Georg are sincere in their offerings of friendship. Early in the story, they hate each other. However, they eventually become trapped under a tree and work through their differences. They agree to save one another no matter whose men arrive first to rescue them. The thoughts the men have while waiting show that they really mean what they have said. Now that Part A is written, I need to get to the work of doing Part B. Remember, I need to choose the most important part of the text to support my point. Looking through this passage, I think the last sentence is the key. It says, and each prayed a private prayer that his men might be the first to arrive, so that he might be the first to show honorable attention to the enemy that had become a friend. That part seems important because it mentions the private prayer, and I think there's some sincerity in prayer. I can explore that more in Part C, but for now, I think I've got my text. So I need a signal phrase and a parenthetical reference. The parenthetical reference is easy. Right there in the prompt it says that this passage comes from page 36. So, in parentheses at the end of my quotation, I'll put the number 36. I now have Part A and B assembled. My signal phrase says, the author writes. That's pretty easy. Then I have my textual evidence, and each prayed a private prayer that his men might be the first to arrive, so that he might be the first to show honorable attention to the enemy that had become a friend. Then I have my quotation mark, the parenthetical reference, 36 for page 36, and then the period comes after. Simple. Part C is the important part. I've got parts A and B assembled, but if I don't have a strong Part C, they don't really matter very much. So I need to ask, how does my textual evidence prove that Georg and Ulrich have sincere feelings? I should think through my answer before I try writing it. As I'm thinking about this passage, the first thing that comes to mind is the prayers are private. The men are not praying for each other. They're not doing it so each other can hear it. It's really just between them and their God. I think if they didn't really mean what they told each other, their private thoughts would probably reveal it. For instance, if they secretly planned to kill each other, the audience would know because that's what the men would have prayed for. Why would someone privately pray for something they didn't want? That just doesn't make sense. Now, maybe later the men would reconsider their decision, if they had lived. But I think in this moment, the fact that the author shows their internal wishes to be consistent with the external words that the men spoke to each other indicates a level of sincerity that we, the readers, should accept. Again, folks probably wouldn't privately pray or wish for something they didn't really want. Now that I've thought through those ideas, I can write them out in a logical way that brings the A, B, and C all together. Here I've done that. For part C I wrote, "These words are important because the author says the prayers are private. The men are not praying aloud for each other. It is between them and God. If the author didn't want the audience to think their words were sincere, he could have shown that in their private thoughts, such as by having each man secretly wish his men would arrive first so he could kill the other and escape the situation. Instead, we see that their internal wishes match with their external words, indicating a level of sincerity that the audience can accept." As you can see, the ABC process came together nicely. In part A, I talked about where in the story this took place, right before the climax when the men had become friends, and I mentioned the fact that they were sincere in wanting to improve their relationship. For part B, I chose the passage that dealt with them praying privately for their wishes to come true, that being that they could save the other man. In part C, I explained that. I connect the textual evidence, the private prayer, to the idea of sincerity, which was the main point. So as you can see, part C connects the ideas of part A to the textual evidence in part B, making it all flow.